Ever since the advent of international communism, the number one target has been the United States of America. They were actually founded by the Illuminati in order to be the seen enemy of the United States of America, which was the greatest nation on the face of the earth. A man by the name of W. Cleon Skousen wrote a book called The Naked Communist. Within the pages of this particular book, he actually outlined 45 points, and he placed these in the congressional record of the United States, by which international communism wanted to actually implement inside the borders of this country so they could literally destroy the United States from within. Now notice what was placed, and I'm going to only pinpoint today in this message one of those 45 points which the communists wanted to achieve within the United States of America. Notice that one objective that I want to discuss today is they wanted to capture one or both of the political parties of the United States of America, and my objective in this message is to show that the last three presidents have done exactly that. Many people who have followed this movement of international communism do not realize that communism and socialism is the same movement. They simply believe that international socialism is the step just before they arrive at pure communism. So what I'd like to do now, in order for you and I to understand that socialism and communism are bedfellows, they're all a part of the same movement, there's no difference in them whatsoever, is I want to give two quotes from individuals, one of them claiming to be a socialist and ran 6 times on the Socialist Party ticket in the United States for the presidency. Then I want to give a quote from a communist that everybody in the world has heard of who has kept up with the international communist movement. Let's break away now and go to those quotes. Mr. Norman Thomas ran 6 times for the candidacy for the President of the United States on the socialist ticket. He said in the past, and notice what he said, it's very important for the American people. The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name liberalism, and we've all heard it, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program. Notice we've been doing this for the last 40 years until America will one day be a socialist nation, not knowing how it happened. Notice now that there was another individual who actually told what international socialism and communism was all about and how they were going to achieve dominance inside the United States of America. 3 months before his 1959 visit to the United States, Nikita Khrushchev, who was then the ruthless dictator of international communism, he said the following, and I quote, "We cannot expect the American people to jump from capitalism to communism, but we can assist their elected leaders in giving them small doses of socialism until they awaken one day to find they have communism." End of quote. Has the United States been progressing towards socialism no matter which president or party, whether it's the Republican or Democrats, are in office? Absolutely yes. Notice this front cover title of a recent magazine called Republican Socialism. It literally describes how no matter what party is in office, they've been leading us down the same primrose path towards socialism. But we need proof that either party, whether they're Republican or Democrat, is leading us to the same conclusion: international socialism, the stepping stone to the final goal to be achieved of international communism. Let's just briefly explore the background of the last 3 presidents to see if they have knowingly or unknowingly led this nation further into the arms of international socialism, preparing for the day when international communism will rule supreme. First, let's take a look at Mr. Ronald Reagan, because he was the one who claimed to be the most conservative president in the last 60 years. Let's review, first of all, a speech made by Mr. Ronald Reagan. Then let's actually see what he has done in politics. Then you can decide for yourself whether he meant what he said in that speech, or whether he followed Mr. Roger Baldwin, who was the founder of the Communist Front organization, the American Civil Liberties Union, when Mr. Baldwin said, and I quote, "We must wave flags and appear to be patriotic, but destroy the system as fast as we can," end of quote. In other words, say one thing to the public to gain votes, but do the exact opposite when you get into office. Now let's cut away to Mr. Reagan's speech.
Well over 200 years have passed since the gallant men that formed our nation met in a carpenter's hall in Philadelphia. They were men of many backgrounds, but all with one common denominator: their faith in God. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Those first Americans proclaimed their freedom because they believed God had granted freedom to all men. For decades, America remained true to her beliefs, thanking God in peacetime and turning to Him in moments of crisis. During the Civil War, perhaps our nation's darkest hour, Abraham Lincoln said, "I would be the most foolish person on this footstool earth if I believed for one moment that I could perform the duties assigned to me without the help of one who is wiser than all." I don't believe any man or woman can serve in this office without understanding exactly what Mr. Lincoln meant. But in recent years not too distant in our past, America did seem to be losing her religious and moral bearings. Our social standards seemed to be dissolving. Our economic and governmental institutions were in disarray. Our defenses had grown weak. All over the world, America was becoming known not for strength and resolve, but for vacillation and self-doubt. It seemed for a season as though our nation was in permanent decline, and that any sense of justice, self-discipline, and duty was ebbing out of public life. But the God who has so richly blessed our land also gave us free will, the power to choose our own destiny. And that is what the American people are doing. After putting a stop to that long decline, we are today seeking a rebirth of freedom and faith, a great national renewal. And we've only just begun. Together, we can show the world that America is and will always remain one nation under God.
Now let's notice some of the background of Mr. Reagan. By 1945, Ronald Reagan had become president of the Left Wing Screen Actors Guild. Left wing means communist. During his tenure, he was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee in connection with the communist writers and actors within that particular union. According to Lou Cannon's book, which he wrote in the 70s called Reagan, he insisted the communists formed a political party, and he would hesitate to see any political party outlawed on the basis of political ideology. In taking this particular position, Mr. Ronald Reagan was simply parroting the typical communist line of that day. Mr. Ronald Reagan became a charter member of the Fabian Socialist Control Americans for Democratic Action in 1950. That was found in the book, Here's the Rest of Him, by Stefkin, put out in 1970. In 1958, Mr. Ronald Reagan became an active member of a Communist Front organization. It was called the National Advisory Committee of the American Veterans. This was found in the California Senate Committee on Un-American Activities, recorded in 1947 to 1952. He also joined and actively supported the Communist Front organizations called the Hollywood branch of the American Veterans Committee and also the Hollywood Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions. Mr. Ronald Reagan played an upfront role in an organization called the California League for a Democratic Far Eastern Policy. This league was very closely linked to and followed the lead of the communist-dominated Institute of Pacific Relations in their particular drive to overthrow China for communism and install the butcher Mao Zedong in control of that great country. The Senate committee, chaired by a Senator Pat McCarran, investigated the Institute for Pacific Relations and reported, and I quote, "The Institute of Pacific Relations is an instrument of communist policy, propaganda, and military intelligence," end of quote. The FBI raided the offices of the Institute of Pacific Relations, their magazine called Amerasia. They found 1,800 sensitive stolen documents of the United States government. These communists, working with George Marshall, Joseph Stilwell, and President Truman at that time, were instrumental in bringing murderous Mao Zedong to power in China by conspiring against our anti-communist friend and ally, Chiang Kai-shek. Without a communist China and the Red Butcher Mao to run it, there would never have been a Korean War. There would have never been an invasion of North Vietnam into South Vietnam, which only benefited international communism and the international bankers that sponsored it. Notice now Mr. Ronald Reagan working with Marxist Alan Cranston from California was a leader in the infamous un-American and communist-dominated United World Federalist. The United World Federalists are working for a one-world government, just like international communism, socialism, Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission. All of these very highly questionable and subversive affiliations occurred during Ronald Reagan's middle age. And he can scarcely use the excuse that he was a youth and that he is not responsible for his one-world socialist activities. All his activities are probably best described by Reagan himself in his campaign book when he ran for governor, then for president of the United States, entitled, "Where's the Rest of Me?" He described himself in that particular publication as a near hopeless liberal. What he neglected to tell the American public when they started to vote was that this was not just a phase that he was going through, but he would never recover from his desire for a one-world socialist government. In 1954, Mr. Ronald Reagan was hired by General Electric Corporation and later became one of the best public relations men that they had. The longtime president of General Electric, a man by the name of Gerard Swoop, authored Franklin Delano Roosevelt's National Recovery Administration Plan, which became the blueprint for corporate socialism in America. That documentation was found in Wall Street and FDR by Anthony Sutton, a 1975 publication. On October 22, 1964, Mr. Ronald Reagan gave a speech called Rendezvous with Destiny. This so enthralled conservatives that they decided, many of them, to support him and finance him for governor for the state of California in 1966. Mr. Reagan campaigned as an arch conservative on the basis of a premise to, and I quote, "squeeze, cut, and trim the size of state government by at least 10%. He sounded like a bargain, but we're going to see if all of this actually took place. Now, it doesn't take a political cynic to conclude early, if you want to identify a politician's real character, you quit listening to what he says, then you turn around and examine what he actually does and he signs into law. Notice what he did in raising taxes. His sales tax increase was 248%, personal income tax 404%, corporate tax 160%, property tax 96%, and gasoline tax 40%. When Mr. Reagan was running for the President of the United States, he said that he would not raise taxes. He said that he wanted to balance the American budget. And yet, for the years of 1981 through 1988 that he was President of the United States, he created more national debt than all presidents combined, starting with George Washington all the way up through his predecessor, Jimmy Carter. So here we can see that every single person who is a socialist believes in the explosion of debt with liberal projects that put the country into further debt. The reason for this is because they know that if they destroy the economic base of a nation, they'll destroy the nation and it'll fall to international socialism and communism, of which Mr. Reagan was either a knowing or unknowing tool. Mr. Ronald Reagan kept bragging about how he got an army of individuals off welfare and onto what he called workfare in the state of California. And yet there were over 2,270,000 on welfare, and he ended up only getting about 9,267 that were ever placed on workfare. And on top of that, he denied welfare to another 886 that was never on it to begin with. And while he was governor of the state of California, welfare skyrocketed and went up 43% in the period of time he was governor. Now, what happened to other socialistic programs? Going to the very records that were compiled by the United Republicans of California, who as early as 1975 issued a resolution outlining what a dangerous man Reagan was, opposed him as a candidate for president, and warned Americans to carefully scrutinize his record before voting. In their 4-page report, they've documented the sordid record of this self-acclaimed conservative. I want to quote just briefly part of that report. Quote, "He liberalized the educational program by appointing liberal Dr. John Ford and others to the State Department of Education. They increased the tempo of progressive socialism while adopting guidelines providing for a non-religious, humanistic school program, eliminating moral values in favor of social change legislation." End of quote. And that was taken from the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, January 15th, 1974, and was made a part of this United Republicans of California's outline of the history of Ronald Reagan. One of the very first bills that he signed as governor was the infamous Sex Education Bill. He also signed Bill AB 2265 in 1972, giving the state regulation and control of private schools. Contrary to federal law, he signed Bill AB 724, ordering the state education department to racially balance and integrate all grades within schools and in all school districts, and enforce this order by forced busing or any other means necessary. Governor Reagan also set up the notorious planning, programming, and budgetary system for California in order to facilitate the unconstitutional and socialist federal funding and control of the state's public schools. What about Mr. Reagan and abortion? In 1967, his very first year in office, Ronald Reagan signed the Belason Abortion Act, which legalized abortion upon demand and to be paid for by Medi-Cal, that is, by all taxpayers of the state of California. By the end of his second term, this biological holocaust totaled 500,000 legalized murders of unwanted babies. This may shed some light on why, as President of the United States, he appointed left-winger, which means socialist communist, Sandra O'Connor to the Supreme Court of the United States. She had promoted abortion upon demand in Arizona for many, many years. What about socialized medicine? It was given a tremendous boost in California when Ronald Reagan signed a total of 11 bills expanding its scope and its cost. When Reagan took office, Medi-Cal had a budget of $252 million. When he left office in 1974, Medi-Cal was spending $1,165 million, an increase of 784% from the time he took office. What about crime control in the state of California? There were more than twice as many major crimes in California when Ronald Reagan left office as there were each year before he was elected as governor. During his tenure as governor of California, he ordered prisons to be emptied and closed down. The largest number of prisoners on parole were preying on citizens of all communities. They attacked them. Murderers were turned loose, drug addicts to go back into society. Ronald Reagan subsidized county governments whose courts did not incarcerate criminals, convicted but immediately freed them on parole. So here is the opportunity in order to truly punish criminals, and yet he turned them loose immediately and paid the local communities to do so. The result was in Los Angeles, California, that 90% of the convicted felons immediately went back into the streets to start their crime wave all over again. He centralized law enforcement and the justice system, cutting out local control and making it state and federal control. He enthusiastically adopted the subversive program of the Federal Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, placing hardened criminals on 72-hour leave, and pursued their policy of early parole, all of which increased major crimes in the state of California, and especially in the city of Los Angeles, under this massive liberalization program. Ronald Reagan was supposedly opposed to gun control laws. At least that's what he stated when he was going around speaking before the public, trying to get elected as governor. While he always favored and supported Nixon's unconstitutional executive order, which saddled Americans with the oppressive regionalization of this country, he preferred to disguise his support by calling it the New Federalism. As soon as he had the authority to do so, Mr. Ronald Reagan actively promoted what is called regionalism. So what is regionalism? This is simply a conspiracy for scrapping our Constitution and the Bill of Rights and destroying the sovereignty of our country, the states' rights, and the nation. So the socialists can impose a one-world socialist government upon us. This idea was nurtured in the Rockefellers' University of Chicago, which has been called the citadel of Fabian socialism in America. Professor Charles E. Merriam was in charge of this program at its headquarters at 1313 East 60th Street in Chicago, Illinois. The whole web of subversion came out to be known to the public as Metro 1313. Do you believe that the United States of America has been placed into 10 regions preparing us for the time when the New World Order will take over and the United States will be divided up? Let's cut away to a film strip now that was taken by me personally. Notice this FEMA facility, which is in Denton, Texas, 800 North Loop 288. It shows graphically that there are 6 or 5 states that is a part of the Federal Emergency Management Agency of Region number 6. There are 10 such regions in the United States. New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana are a part of this particular FEMA agency. And it looks more like a military installation because it's going to be that agency that will take over and run the government when the emergency is declared. This particular movement, FEMA, is to be a silent socialist revolution promoted by gradualism. They're very patient people. That would eliminate county government, state boundaries, county boundaries, and it would do away with elected representatives. It would eliminate local, state, or national control. It would limit our right to work, travel, or live where we chose, with no more Army, Navy, or Air Force, no freedom of speech or religion. This transfer of powers from cities, states, and counties to a centralized federal level and then to a totalitarian world government will be accomplished by transferring power from elected officials to the unelected bureaucrats. Do you ever wonder why we elect mayors, county commissioners, and state governors, and they put on the public payroll city managers, county managers, and the president appoints regional chairmen, all of whose function is to govern the governors, state legislators, county supervisors, mayors, and councilmen? Because for 5 decades, Americans have been brainwashed by the humanists in our schools and media to accept full socialism. They seem right for the imposition of regionalism when the time came. On February 10th, 1972, President Nixon, in flagrant disregard for his oath of office and Article 10 of the Constitution, inserted Executive Order number 11,647 in the Federal Registry, eliminating state and county boundaries, thus reducing the 50 states to 10 federal regions. 11 days later, President Richard Nixon assigned 10 regional chairmen of FEMA, answerable only to the President of the United States, to carry out the federal edicts to all regularly elected officials in their federal region. These 10 men are assigned, not elected, not answerable or responsible to the citizens that they control, and they cannot be removed from office by the people. we're actually operating under two governments at the present time. Number one, what is left of our constitutional elected government, which is rapidly losing power. And number two, the unelected regional world government that only takes and carries out orders from the communist-controlled United Nations and Metro 1313 Syndicate. On propositions that Ronald Reagan submitted for vote of the people, Reagan approved changes in the wording of the State of California Constitution designed, I quote, to transfer the inherent power of the people, end of quote, to the, and I quote again, inherent power of the legislature, end of quote. Meaning, of course, the unelected bureaucrats. So they were just taking power away from the people and giving it to the unelected bureaucrats. This was done with no explanation to the voters of the real loss of freedom and control that they were giving up. Reagan also advocated a change in the state constitution, giving a non-governing or non-government body the power to tax. This information was found in the Los Angeles Times, January 3rd, 1967. In 1971, Ronald Reagan signed Bill AB 1301, making it mandatory for Californians to obtain state or regional approval before they could sell any of their land, no matter how small a parcel it was. He further decreased property rights through a series of land use bills and redevelopment laws. He urged state authority over coastal property. He supported creation of the Lake Tahoe regional government, allocating some California land to Nevada in line with federal guidelines. Governor Reagan also called for streamlining local governments by merging cities and counties in California. This required the elimination of numerous county governments, which Reagan called, I quote, a horse and buggy system of local government, end of quote. That was also found in the Los Angeles Times. What about gun control and Governor Reagan? While campaigning for governor and then later president of the United States, Reagan promised to assist any effort that would take from the American citizen his right to own and carry firearms. However, in 1968, Governor Reagan signed into California law the Mulford Act, which was the most sweeping and progressive or repressive gun control legislation passed in the United States up until that date. This bill nullified any citizen's right to defend himself and banned loaded guns from any public street or highway in California unless the owner could prove that he was in some kind of imminent danger of attack. That was found in the book Here's the Rest of Him, page 60 and 61. However, Ronald Reagan, not satisfied with the stifling of Californians' constitutional rights, Article 2 that is, Governor Reagan enthusiastically embraced the plan proposed by the Federal Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which would eventually provide for the confiscation of all guns. Governor Reagan agreed with the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration to make California a model pilot state for the whole country for the confiscation of your firearms. Under the guise of reform for criminal justice improvement, Reagan appointed and arranged for financing the State Office of Criminal Justice Planning. With a large staff, they were to be the task force to carry out the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration program of prohibiting the private possession of handguns. And what you need to understand is that any time the socialist communists are nearly ready for the takeover of a country, the last program they start popularizing is the confiscation of all guns, so there'll be no one to stand up against them when they take over that country. All of the information that I've given you so far is a part of Governor Reagan and President Reagan's history in placing bills into law. And you can't come to but one conclusion. That conclusion was that Ronald Reagan is not, was not, never has been, and never will be a political conservative. He actively supports world socialism and world government. His becoming president, after he became president, he actually called for free trade and received it with Canada, and then President Bush followed up. He pushed through the Genocide Convention Treaty to the United Nations Organization. I want to stop here and discuss that for just a moment. Every president of the United States had rejected the Genocide Convention Treaty, even though it had been brought forward. The Senate had not passed it into law ever since 1947 and 48, when it was adopted by the United Nations Organization. And the reason why is all the lawyers that read it stated that it was definitely against individuals and not against, say, Nazi war crimes or Russian war crimes to eliminate whole populations for political reasons. But it was designed to be against individuals. And within the pages of the law itself, it states that you can be arrested for causing someone else mental harm. And Mr. Reagan, a professing Christian, stated, or he is the one who actually introduced this, starting his second term into the presidency. Only after a conference with David Rockefeller and members of the Council on Foreign Relations, then they sponsored him for the second term to be reelected. And the first thing he called for was the Genocide Convention Treaty to the United Nations to be passed into law. So anyone, and in the United States today, laws are being passed in all 50 states. They're called hate crime laws. And they read practically word for word, just like the Genocide Convention Treaty to the United Nations. So if you and I are convicted on a local level of some genocide crime, it's simply a hate crime, calling somebody a racial slur. Or it's designed really to shut down anybody stating the things that I'm saying today, talking about the rise of world government and all of these organizations that's being used to promote world government. And then also they said that anyone who was in consistent agreement with someone who was accused of genocide, then they also could be punished just because you agreed with that person. So this was Mr. Ronald Reagan's background. So we can see that he was working right into the hands, either knowingly or unknowingly, with those who are working for world government. One of the most evil things that Mr. Ronald Reagan ever concocted was Rex 84. This was worked on in the East Wing of the White House by Colonel Oliver North, called Ollie North. Rex 84 is a plan by which they're refurbishing old military installations and the prison system around it. They're now building as many as 37 that are verified, and it's rumored up to 100 prison camps for what they called illegal aliens. However, these holding and detention centers for illegal aliens, anyone who understands the plan for world government knows that it's going to be a program by which the United States, when they declare martial law or when the Federal Emergency Management Agency takes over and the United Nations military equipment starts rolling and occupying America for world government, American citizens who do not want to give up their freedom, patriots, Christians, and so on, are going to be rounded up in massive numbers and placed in these concentration camps. They're scattered all over the United States of America. And this was designed during the Ronald Reagan administration, his first term, by Colonel Oliver North in the East Wing of the White House. One of the largest holding facilities is in Alaska on Highway 3. They say it will hold up to 1 million individuals. There are other areas. One is out in the desert of Arizona that's been seen by former military personnel who were about to retire, and they went driving in the desert a week before their retirement was to take place, just having fun with their buddies, and they ran upon this installation where there were barbed wire turned in to keep people from breaking out, and it was just row after row after row of barracks, and yet not one single individual was there at the military installation. So yes, there is coming something awfully horrible for those in the United States of America, and the presidency of the United States has been used to foment this evil conspiracy. Mr. George W. Bush succeeded Ronald Reagan as the next president of the United States for the Republican Party. And the very first thing he did, and he ran as one of his mottos, was, "Read my lips, no new taxes." However, Senator Moynihan raised the lip of George Bush in this cartoon and saw underneath it that there were some things that you could not read that was found underneath his lips. Does George Bush know about the New World Order? According to Parade magazine of July 2nd, 1989, it quoted President Bush as saying that desire for freedom from tyranny inspired the world and still does. Look on the back of any dollar bill and you'll see it. The Great Seal of the United States bears the motto, Novus Ordo Seclorum, meaning a new order of the ages. Notice on the back side of the $1 bill the word Annuit Coeptus. This literally means God has smiled upon our endeavor. And at the bottom of the pyramid, notice Novus Ordo Seclorum, and as George Bush stated, it means the new order of the ages, showing that he does know what is happening on the world scene and that he's actively helping to build a new world order.
Stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order.
President Bush spoke before the United Nations on October 1st, 1990, where he confirmed his support of world government by the year 2000 or shortly thereafter. I quote him, "We," meaning members of the United Nations, "must join together in a new compact, all of us, to bring the United Nations into the 21st century. The calendar offers up a convenient milestone, a signpost by which to measure our progress as a community of nations. The year 2000 marks a turning point, beginning the turn of the new millennium. The United Nations can bring about a new day to press forward to cap an historic movement toward a new world order." End of quote. And of course, we know the only movement in the 20th century has been toward international socialism and communism, of which Mr. George Bush, as we'll show, has been a part of all those movements. This left-hand side of the dollar bill, if you'll get one out and look at it, also contains a pyramid with an all-seeing eye above it. You will also notice that the capstone or cornerstone has been removed off the pyramid, and that the all-seeing eye has replaced it. A woman by the name of Sharon Boyd, writing in the New Age magazine, What Is, proclaims, and I quote, "Ancient Freemasonry employed the triangle, usually in connection with the all-seeing eye, throughout the entire system of Masonry. No symbol is more important in its significance. It is the Masonic symbol of the grand architect of the universe. The entire symbol of the eye of providence, the all-seeing eye, and the radiant triangle forms a cornerstone of the unfinished pyramid." Information came from the book Occult America, the United States Founded on Occultism, Not Christianity, What Is, Volume 1 by Sharon Boyd. As President, George Bush has surrounded himself with fellow brothers of what is called the Skull and Bone. And now we'll show you a book that has been put out by Anthony Sutton called The Introduction to the Order. And this actually proves that he is interlinked with related groups such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and other groups like the Bilderbergers that are working for world government. On the very day that Mr. George Bush kicked off his presidency, Bush signaled his unchanging allegiance to the Brotherhood. At his inauguration ceremony, his oath of office was actually sworn. He was sworn in with his hand resting on the Masonic Bible that was furnished to him by his fellow Masons at St. John's Masonic Lodge, 71 West 23rd Street, New York City. It was the same Bible printed in London, England in 1767 that was used at the inauguration of Warren G. Harding, Dwight David Eisenhower, and Jimmy Carter. These three presidents were all Masons, as was George Bush. For his national security advisor and right-hand man, George Bush chose Brent Scowcroft, and Scowcroft as intelligence. He was an intelligence buff with international banking connections before he became the head of the National Security Advisory. He had also been president previously of Kissinger and Associations, and this was found in the U.S. News and World Report, October 7th, 1991, page 28 and 29. Now, this is the world, this Kissinger and Associate, the world's most prestigious and influential lobbyist firm, ruled and headed by Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, who also, his double agent KGB code name was Bohr during World War II. In turn, Kissinger's mentor or benefactor has long been billionaire David Rockefeller. David Rockefeller, indisputably one of the world's richest men, and as one of its chief power brokers, has the highest regard for the members of the Skull and Bone. Rockefeller Finance Services Incorporated, the main corporate entity in the Rockefeller family's expensive and extensive business empire, is personally managed by a bonesman, member of the Skull and Bones organization, the very aggressively brilliant J. Richardson Dilworth, who was a Skull and Bones class of 1938. In 1973, Rockefeller, with the help of disciples Zygmunt Brzezinski and Averell Harriman, both bonesmen of the Skull and Bones class of 1917, the same as Prescott S. Bush, George Bush's father, founded what is called the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission is a group with a goal of hastening the era of world government and promoting an international economy controlled behind the scenes by the secret brotherhood of which George Bush is a part, the Skull and Bone. Brzezinski was President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and intelligence coordinator, the same position held by Henry Kissinger in the Nixon and Ford administrations, and now by Brent Scowcroft when George Bush was as the President of the United States. George Bush has served in the past as a director of the Globalist Trilateral Commission, while both Jimmy Carter and Henry Kissinger have long been active members of the same group. Moreover, as we shall discover in our detailed explanation of the unusual and rapid rise to political stardom of George Bush, it was Richard Nixon who, as president, played a key role in catapulting the young bonesman to the top of the political heap. In other words, he helped him to get started in the oil business. In turn, Richard Nixon's chief mentor and backer, once again, was David Rockefeller. So in other words, David Rockefeller, billionaire, chairman of the multinational Chase Manhattan Bank, Council on Foreign Relations, czar, Bilderberger overseer, and founder of the Trilateral Commission, has, through his insiders in the Oval Office of the White House, successfully manipulated the foreign and economic policies of the United States for a quarter of a century or more. Events have proven that George Bush, though very wary of his public image and vulnerability to the electorate, and he gave up and did not even hardly campaign for the presidency against the Democratic Party in 1991, nevertheless has systematically carried out the blueprint and agenda of his benefactors in the secret brotherhood since his first days in public office as a young and aspiring U.S. congressman from Houston, Texas. George Bush has always been keenly aware that his power base depends on his standing in the polls, not just the polls and the electorate, but his power base depends on the degree to which he is able to please his superiors and his peers in the Skull and Bone fraternity and the even more powerful elite of the secret brotherhood, the group that oversees and directs the activities of all the secret societies. As Guy Molinaw recently noted in his political newsletter, The Commonwealth Report, this is Bush's only existential belief, that politics is based on the personal relationship of leaders, that doing politics means hammering things out with a handful of major figures. End of quote. This was found in the Los Angeles Weekly, January 4th through the 10th, 1991, page 13. That handful of major figures that George Bush talked about most certainly includes his bosses in the Brotherhood. My research and investigation in the Brotherhood reveals that George Bush, as president of the world's greatest military nation, the United States of America, is the ultimate insider. While the people of the United States and the other 226 countries of the world view the president as the central figure in world affairs, the real truth is that George Bush is only one of its directors. He is not chairman of the board, though his personal influence is very considerable and should not be discounted. Now, the frequent mention of CIA involvement in the world conspiracy is not by happenstance. My own investigation and the investigation of many, many other people who have greater access to information reveals that the men who run the networks of the secret brotherhood have for decades controlled the America's Central Intelligence Agency as well as the spy agencies of Great Britain and other countries. So it is not coincidental that George Bush of the Skull and Bones class of 1947 was magically chosen in the late 1970s to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Nor was it mere circumstance and coincidence that William Casey, Reagan's appointee to be the chief of the Central Intelligence Agency, belonged to yet another brotherhood-linked secret society called the Knights of Malta. Lady Queensborough, in her highly acclaimed 2-volume work called Occult Theocracy, had this to say about the Illuminati takeover of international spy organizations. Quote, "Ancient and accepted Scottish rites, that's Freemasonry, runs its own secret service, which cooperates with the national secret services of all countries, thus serving the aims and purposes of internationalism." End of quote. First Vice President George Bush, then later President of the United States, let the thousands of individuals assembled as delegates know, and the tens of millions of others who were watching television, that he had a destiny to fulfill, which he described as a mission in order for him to perform. In fact, his speech was peppered 10 times with the word mission. The secret brotherhood believes its great work, the illumination of mankind, is a glorious mission in which they are to achieve. Is this what George Bush had in mind when he made the following remark? I quote, "I am a man who sees life in terms of missions, defined and missions completed. The most important work of my life is to complete the mission we started in 1980. That's when he was vice president to President Reagan." I'll continue his quote. "Let me tell you more about the mission. A nation's leader must be able to define and lead a mission." End of quote. President George Bush followed his father, Prescott Bush, into the secret Yale University fraternity of Skull and Bones. Only 15 members a year are selected to enter that particular Skull and Bones society. Out of these, some eventually are allowed to know the secrets of the coming world government. President Bush resigned a 2-year stint on the board of directors of the Council on Foreign Relations in 1978-1979 so that he could run for the vice presidency of the United States. The inner core of both the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission are working for world government. The Council on Foreign Relations was founded in part by Marxist Colonel Edward Mandell House. David Rockefeller of International Banking was chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations and also founded the Trilateral Commission and became its chairman of the board. And President Bush were members of all of these organizations. President Bush wants to establish a new world order by the year 2000. He believes that they are destined to usher in this new era of peace and prosperity for the whole world, hopefully by the year 2000. Notice the text of his speech to the nation on January 16, 1991, as it was reported in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch of January 17, 1991. Quote, "Our objective is clear. Saddam Hussein's forces will leave Kuwait. Iraq will eventually comply with all United Nations resolutions, and then, when peace is restored, it is our hope that Iraq will live as a peaceful and cooperative member of the family of nations, thus enhancing the security and stability of the Gulf. I, George Bush, had hoped that when the United States Congress, in historic debate, took its resolute action, Saddam would realize that he could not prevail and would move out of Kuwait in accordance with the United Nations resolutions. He did not do that. Saddam was warned over and over again to comply with the will of the United Nations. Leave Kuwait or be driven out. Tonight, 28 nations, countries from 5 continents, Europe and Asia, Africa, and the Arab League, have forces in the Gulf area standing shoulder to shoulder against Saddam Hussein. This is an historic moment. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order. A world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order. An order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping rule to fulfill the promise and vision of the United Nations founders. George Bush sounds just like the book of Revelation in chapter 13, verse 4, where he said, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And if he's in reference to the United Nations, that's exactly what that sounds like to me. Does President Bush know the plans to have world government by the year 2000? In his speech to the United Nations on October 1st, 1990, he said, quote, "We must join together in a new compact to bring the United Nations into the 21st century. The calendar offers up a convenient milestone, a signpost by which to measure our progress as a community of nations. The year 2000 marks a turning point, beginning the turn of the millennium. The United Nations can help bring about a new day to press forward to cap an historic movement," and of course he means of world socialism, "toward a new world order." End of quote. That was found in the New York Times, October 2nd, 1990, page A6. He knows our money shows the same hope. Quote from the Parade magazine of July 2nd, 1989, page 5, that the desire for freedom from tyranny inspired the world and still does. He said, "Look on the back of any dollar bill, and you'll see it. The Great Seal of the United States bears the motto, Novus Ordo Seclorum, meaning a new order of the ages." On March 6, 1989, a radio station aired part of a speech that Bush delivered. He said, and I quote, "What are we doing to prepare ourselves for the new world coming just 11 short years from now?" Remember, that was 1989. You add 11, that puts it at the year 2000. No wonder he said they had to make war with Iraq to establish the United Nations as the world authority to bring us into the 21st century.